It gives me great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Professor Thomas Pink of King's College London, who is one of the patrons of the Latin Mass Society. And he's going to talk about tradition, secular and religious.
Thank you. Humans are social animals, and it's fundamental to our flourishing and our lives as individuals that we share customs with one another. We follow practices in common. These are to be found within the church and outside her as well. We're here today because, of course, we value the traditional liturgical customs of the church. And the crisis concerning liturgy means we need to think very carefully about customs, what standing they should have, on what basis they can be criticised, and on what basis they should be retained. Some customs, of course, can be bad, but many of the good customs are important parts of morality to the extent of being morally obligatory. Morality comes from the Latin mos, a custom. I just want to begin by looking at the way in which customs might put a moral obligation on us to follow them. Some customs are imposed on us by human nature as such. They're part of the law of nature. Our human nature dictates that we must behave towards each other in certain ways. For Catholics, it's clear that the institution of marriage involves customs that are obligatory under natural law. Okay. But there are other customs that, as individuals, we're under a moral obligation to follow, where it looks as though the obligation arises out of the custom. It's a genuine moral obligation, but before the custom had been established, we wouldn't have been under any obligation to behave that way. An obvious example are things like traffic rules. We all need to be able to move around in an ordered fashion in large cities. And we need to avoid chaos. So we need to determine customs about how to move about. Do we drive on the left or on the right? Should this be a one-way street or a two-way street, and so forth? Until it's established how we should behave, until some custom of moving about in a certain way has been established, we're under no particular obligation to drive on the left or on the right. But once that custom has arisen, it then binds us. So we've got custom as part of natural morality, and then we've got custom as part of conventional morality. Perfectly good moral obligation, but custom has produced it. We've kind of partly made it ourselves in order to act together better. Now that distinction, I think almost all moral philosophers and I think theologians have accepted one form or another, but it gets very difficult where you try to draw the boundary line between the natural in morality and the conventional. And here there's been a lot of disagreement, and it has much to do with disagreement about human nature itself. If you've got a rich theory of human nature, like Catholics do, and see us as bearing the image of God in a way that differentiates us from the lower animals, then you will be able to find ways of explaining how important parts of morality are natural. They arise out of our complex human nature and our bearing of the image of God, particularly through our possession of a capacity for reason and a capacity for freedom. And I'll come back to those. But if you've got an impoverished theory of human nature, if you think we're just clever animals who can use language, but otherwise pretty much like the rest of them, then you're going to not have a lot of material in which to explain natural morality. And you're going to start making out more and more parts of morality are conventional. They're the creation just of our own custom. They could have been otherwise, as we could have driven on the other side of the road. David Hume, to whom I shall return, thought that the institution of marriage and the morality concerning that was entirely conventional. It's entirely the product of human custom, and it could have been otherwise. And that sort of shift into turning morality into our creation, a creation of our custom, is a very important feature, as I'll say, of the fallen world. Okay. Once we got the idea of custom as important in morality, it can also be important in another way. It's part of human happiness to feel at home in the world and to feel at home in our own culture. This at-homeness really matters to our happiness. It's not pleasant to feel completely dislocated or alienated from one's surrounding culture. And part of the function of custom is to leave our own culture familiar to us, because we've got an established way of doing things together that we're familiar with. Okay, and I'm going to come back to the importance of being at home. Sometimes it's a bad idea to be at home. There are some environments where we shouldn't feel at home at all. We should feel a bit dislocated, otherwise something's gone very badly wrong. Once we've got this idea of customs as part of a shared human culture, we can then make a distinction between traditional society. A traditional society is full of settled customs. Everyone's agreed about them. Everyone's agreed about their role. Everyone's immensely deferential to established custom. And you know exactly what's going to happen. And now, by contrast to traditional society, we have the hellhole where we now live, which is modernity. And this is full of unstable customs. Customs are inherently subject to dispute and prone to change. And we might not feel very much at home at all some of the time. And we can introduce with modernity two opposing characters. They didn't used to exist before modernity, but now they do. There's the conservative. No conservatives in traditional society, the question never arose. There's the conservative modernity who tries to protect existing customs and defend them and tries to encourage us to defer to them. It's a bit like playing kink and ute against the waves nowadays, but that's what the conservative does. And then there's the liberal who actually rejoices in all the change and is prone to criticize custom and thinks we should be very critical of custom and invokes very often a standard of reason on the basis of which we can criticize customs and change them. Okay, so where as Catholics do we stand in this landscape, living as we do in modernity? How far should we be conservative? How far should we be sometimes on the side of the liberal, perhaps for different reasons? Well, we very often, naturally nowadays, tend to think we're on the side of conservatives a lot of the time. And a lot of Catholics do talk about the faith as if it was a naturally conservative thing. But that's very much a local contingency of the here and now. It's because we live in a society where Christianity is part of our past. And so someone who is critical of and undermining of custom is very often a de-Christianizer. So the modern liberal is very often a kind of opponent of or hostile to historical Christianity. But that's just where we are now. In areas of the world where Christianity has just arrived, it's very different. There, Christianity can be immensely destructive of the local culture, and rightly, because the customs there are bad. My wife and I have a great friend who's quite senior in the East African Jesuits. He's from a Ugandan family. And there the church is fighting ceaseless battle with local customs and traditions. Two stick out in particular: polygamy and witchcraft. They're always dealing with that as a problem to be extirpated. Go with progress on that front. Or go back to the late 4th century in our part of the world, where Christianity was still young, where much of the Roman Senate was still pagan. An immense battle began when the Christian Emperor Gratian, ordered the removal of a central feature of the traditional liturgy of ancient Rome, which was the altar to the goddess Victory in the Senate House. It's removed, much to the horror of much of the families of Rome, and then one of the senators, a pagan, Symmachus, petitions the following emperor, Valentinian II, for its return in the name of tradition. St. Ambrose says to Valentinian in a famous letter that this request must be denied, tradition must be removed. But this is what St. Ambrose says to Valentinian, but Symmachus says, the rights of our ancestors ought to be retained. What? When all things since have progressed towards what is better? Lands released from misty darkness have been amazed at the new sun. The day does not shine at its very beginning, but brightens as its light increases with the advance of time. What a liberal. Okay. There's, of course, a very deep reason why Catholics have got to be tend to a degree of a critical attitude to human customs, and that's because of the fall. All human societies that are in recorded history outside Scripture are fallen societies. What's the fall? It's damaged our human nature. It's damaged, in particular, our ability to understand and act on morality. It, very importantly, has not completely removed our ability to understand morality. That remains. Otherwise, Catholic philosophers of the Middle Ages like Aquinas couldn't have learned from Aristotle. So there's a shared understanding between the pagans and the Christians. But fallen humanity's understanding of morality is imperfect. We may have an institution of marriage, but we might get parts of it wrong, like we might think that polygamy is okay, or divorce, or things like that. And again, we will often find it very hard consistently, just as fallen, even though we can do the right thing occasionally, out of the right motives, in a morally good way, we find it very difficult, if not impossible, consistently to do that. Particularly, this is going to affect settled customs. They may be objectively good still, because they meet certain fundamental human needs, and we haven't lost our ability to understand those, but the motives out of which we follow these customs and the basis on which we understand them may be seriously damaged, and I'll come back to that. So what the Church does, she may learn from the pagan world, but she also corrects it, and she corrects it by the help of the only cure for the fall, the help of divine grace. In late scholasticism, grace is often referred to as higher reason. It's a supernatural equivalent of the light of reason that takes us to supernatural forms of goodness and truth. And not only does it take us to something far above our natural human capacities, the beatific vision of heaven, but it repairs damage done to our power of natural reason. So within the framework of the community of the Church, grace enables us to correct the mistakes of the pagans, to improve fallen man's moral notions, and to develop a more profound understanding of the natural law and what it demands. Okay. There's another reason why I think Catholicism has always been a little bit guarded about certain aspects of the customary, and this is connected with the way custom enables us to feel at home. The point is that we are living in this fallen but also transitory world in the here and now, and we should not be too much at home where we are, because this is not our homeland. This is not our patria. We are viatores, we are wayfarers to another destination in heaven. And we mustn't use an excessive attachment to custom as a kind of this worldly comfort blanket, a way of being too much at home amongst things that must surely pass. Now, nostalgia for a lost human past is a particular feature of modernity. It's one reason why conservatism is a particularly modern phenomenon, because there's a lot of the human past that is no longer with us, and people get very upset at that. Okay. I just want to look at one particular interesting convention, or custom, that we will follow, that fallen human philosophers think about very differently from the way that Catholics used to do. And it's to do with this shift from understanding customs as imposed on us by nature, as part of natural morality, to coming to try to conceive of them as purely conventional. And the practice I'm going to talk about briefly is the practice of making and keeping agreements, of exchanging promises. something we're all involved in, and it carries with it a moral obligation to keep one side of the agreement, to act as one has promised. So where does this obligation come from? A very, very influential theory of the obligation to keep promises and agreements was devised in the 18th century by David Hume. And it's a theory of how the obligation is not part of natural morality at all. It's arisen entirely through human conventions, the better to enable basically selfish human beings to cooperate together. So they're going to start off with a picture of humans as basically rather clever, but in the context of agreements, predominantly selfish people. This is not a very elevating view of human nature. You see what might have gone wrong to develop this way of understanding promising and agreement. But Hume is very clear that the promising practice and the promising obligation are not naturally intelligible. They're not just through our human nature things that we understand, any more than, a caveman just on their basis of human nature would have understood driving on the left rather than the right, or the importance of doing that. As Hume says, I say first that a promise is not intelligible naturally, nor antecedent to human conventions, and that a man unacquainted with society, so you're not familiar with any customs, could never enter into any engagements or agreements with another, even though they could perceive each other's thoughts by intuition. Just knowing about each other's human nature and what's going on in their heads won't make promising comprehensible to you. So how we got this suddenly to us very familiar institution of practice of making and keeping agreements and feel bound by it? Well, think of us just as selfish human beings living together. Just because we're selfish doesn't mean we don't need other people's help. We're totally dependent on other human beings for helping us. How, just assuming we're all selfish, is that help going to arise? How are people going to cooperate together, which in a way that involves an exchange of help between them, an exchange of services? I might offer to do something for you today if you will do something for me tomorrow, but you're selfish. Once I've helped you, you've got what you want. Why are you going to help me back? So I can't expect that you'll help back. So I won't help you first either. And so, human cooperation starts collapsing, becomes very unstable. So what we need is a practice that ties people's self-interest to reciprocating help. So we establish, over time, a convention. If you say words like, let's agree, or I promise to each other, then you better do what you've promised. And if you don't, it's part of the convention that you're not trusted again. You're excluded from future cooperation. No one will help you. That ties your self-interest in the context of the use of those words always to helping back, if you're the second person to be helped. And then everyone, just as selfish, in the context of this convention, can see each other as credible cooperators, because once the promising convention is invoked, people will, just out of selfishness, and liking self-interest, reciprocate. Okay. So it's a nice theory. Economists love it. We've got a nice theory about how selfish people can be got to cooperate for mutual advantage, feeling secure that even though everyone's selfish, they will do what they say, provided they use the words I promise. Okay. And everyone benefits from this, and so we regard it as a moral obligation. This is not how Catholic scholastics used to think about the obligation to keep promises at all. Not at all. They thought the obligation to keep agreements was part of natural justice. Why did they think that? Well, they were always convinced of it, but by the late Middle Ages, a theory of the moral implications of our bearing the image of God emerges. A theory that looks at human nature as bearing the image of God and explains the obligation to keep promises in terms of a theory of natural rights. Here's how it works. We're not bunny rabbits. We have special capacities bearing the image of God that they don't possess. We can reason, but we can also control our actions. we have a capacity to determine for ourselves what we do. I can determine for myself whether I raise my hand or lower it. They call this power of self-determination freedom, libertas. It's free will, basically. And God has given us this power. So we must, by the later Middle Ages, they reason, have a right under the law of nature to use this power, provided we don't exercise the power in a way that breaches other people's obligations or harms them. So we have, in addition to this power of self-determination, liberty as a right, the jus libertatis, which is a right to self-determination. And you can see the intimate relation of these two notions of the power and the right in everyday English. I might communicate to you that I can control whether I raise my hand or lower it by saying to you, oh yeah, I'm in control. It's up to me whether I raise my hand or lower it. Now take a case where you come along and, without any authority, try to tell me what to do. Keep your hand down. Don't you dare raise it. And I might say to you, who are you telling me what to do? It's up to me what I do. And here I'm asserting my liberty as a right not to be subject to direction and coercion by others without proper authority. Okay. And then if you look at agreements, they're just a practice that protects this right. You can violate a person's right to determine for themselves what they do by, exercising coercive force on them without justification. But you can also breach it through breaking an agreement. The purpose of an agreement is to enable us, each of us, to set terms on what they're prepared to do for other people when they're not initially under any obligation to do anything particular for another person. Okay. I've got this right to determine for myself what to do. So I've got a right to determine for myself whether I will mow your garden or not. And if I choose, I can insist as a condition of my doing that tomorrow you pay me 10 quid. Otherwise, I'm not doing it. Sorry. And that protects my right to set the terms to what I do for you. It's part of the way I determine for myself what I do, including what I do for you. And then if you don't pay me the 10 quid tomorrow, you violated my right to determine for myself what I do because you've extracted a service from me that I was not initially willing to give, doing your lawn for free. You violated in just the same way as if you'd exercised coercive force to make me, by force, mow your lawn without getting paid. So breach of agreement is a violation of our right to determine for ourselves what we do, our right to liberty, just as much as coercive pressure. That's why they thought that the practice of making and keeping agreements wasn't simply about enabling selfish people to act together. It was about protecting a God-given right to exercise our power of freedom within the boundaries of natural law as we wish, on terms acceptable to ourselves. Someone like Hume is no longer running this theory because he no longer has a conception of us as having a power of freedom like that. He just thinks of us as clever, selfish animals. So, of course, he's got to find some other basis for the obligation. Not all modern Catholic thinkers understand or are happy with the morality of individual rights as part of natural law, despite the fact it was being part of the Catholic tradition for hundreds of years. Okay. They will say this was unknown to Aristotle and the ancient Greeks. And we will then start entering into exercises under the guise of Catholicism or Christianity, which are really exercises in nostalgia for a past purely human custom. And I'm going to turn to a figure who's been very, very influential in modern Catholic thought. Deservedly so, because he's a very interesting writer, but in ways that sometimes are a little problematic. I'm thinking of Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue. In After Virtue, just as in the Christian account of the fall, we are subject to a loss in the here and now of moral understanding. It's the beginning of the book is saying once we had moral understanding and now we don't. As he says, we possess indeed simulacra of morality We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. Now that's extremely strong. This is not what Catholicism has historically said. Otherwise we couldn't have learnt from the pagans, happily, if the world outside the church didn't have any moral understanding at all. And it's not certainly what Catholicism thinks about any of us today. Okay, so this is, I think that MacIntyre was going for a bit of rhetorical colour at the beginning of the book, but let's take him at his word. Okay, why do we have just simulacra of morality in our minds? Well, we've lost traditional society. We've lost the traditional society of ancient Greece, what he calls the heroic Greek societies, where everyone shared traditions, where everyone understood their role in the same terms, where everyone shared conceptions of the virtues, and they had a shared conception of the good that was the end of human life. We no longer live in that society, we live in modernity. And that's why we've got nothing more than simulacra, because we don't have the right sort of society to have a proper moral understanding. To the extent that we have any moral understanding at all, it's through a traditional or cultural link or continuity with those past societies that have now disappeared. There is no way, MacIntyre says, to possess the virtues except out of a tradition in which we inherit them and our understanding of them from a series of predecessors in which, says his cultural transmission, in which series heroic societies, the heroic societies of ancient Greece, hold first place. And then he says there are some groups, even in the modern world, that have a little more than that, because they live in traditional sub-communities. He describes sub-communities in the United States around the 1980s when he wrote the book, where we have a less distorted, less purely simulacra sort of understanding of morality. These are societies of Catholic Irish, some Orthodox Greeks, some Jews of an Orthodox persuasion, all of them communities that inherit their moral tradition not only through their religion, but also from the structure of the peasant villages and households which their immediate successors inhabited on the margins of modern Europe. So if you really want to understand morality, you've got to be close to being someone from peasant Europe. This is clearly an exercise in cultural nostalgia, and it goes on. What about the notion of a natural human right? MacIntyre is very hostile to it because it was unknown to the ancient Greeks. It would, of course, be a little odd that there should be such rights attaching to human beings simply qua human beings, in the light of the fact that there's no expression in any ancient language correctly translated by our expression of right until near the close of the Middle Ages. There are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and in unicorns. It doesn't occur to MacIntyre that the influence of grace through a better understanding within the community of the church of our status as bearing the image of God and having a power of freedom might have led to a theory of liberty as a right, quite properly. A theory of liberty as a right that, unfortunately, the corrupted morals of the ancient Greeks did not understand, which is why we have ancient slavery, a very serious evil. Okay, so what we've got here is a very, I think, it comes from Hegel, I think, secular conservative project of trying to recover morality, not through grace, not through the present community of the church, but somehow through recreation of traditional society. But that won't help you, will you? I mean, it's very difficult to escape from modernity anyway. Never really understood how MacIntyre proposed to do it. But even if you did escape from modernity, you won't escape from the fall, because the fall held good in ancient societies. You know, the heroic societies of ancient Greece were full of vile murder and violence, slavery, infanticide, and an ignorance of natural human rights. Okay, so I've been trying to counsel against too ready a form of nostalgia and conservatism about human custom. Within the church in the 1960s, there were groups, very senior groups, including Pope Paul VI, who developed an attitude to our traditional customs in the liturgy that treated them like another form of cultural nostalgia, a comfort blanket to keep us happy in the here and now, which the church had to rip away. Here's an address by Paul VI at a general audience in 1969. A new rite of the Mass, a change in a venerable tradition that has gone on for centuries. This change also touches the faithful. It is intended to interest each one of those present, to draw them out of their customary personal devotions or their usual torpor. Nice guy. It is the kind of upset caused by every novelty that breaks into our habits. We shall notice that pious persons are disturbed most because they have their own respectable way of hearing Mass, and they will feel shaken out of their usual thoughts. But it is Christ's will. Okay, so this is the theory of, just like, it's no different from someone who's excessively nostalgic about some dead court custom. This is just conservative nostalgia, and it's actually an obstacle to the gospel. And I'm going to briefly end by suggesting that this cannot be the case. There's a fundamental distinction between our religious tradition, our traditional liturgical customs, and the past human customs that in most cases we can never return to, and we certainly shouldn't feel too attached to, unless they're actually demanded by morality itself. Okay, the first thing to point out, to show that liturgical tradition is not simply a comfort blanket to maintain or restore some human past, is that the traditional liturgy is simply not just another custom of the human past. It has maintained its form through many changes in human society right into modernity, under the influence of divine grace. I assume grace has been operative in the liturgical history of the Church over many centuries, a force that in itself operates to detach us from this world, not to make us more at home in it. Secondly, in its ceremonies and texts, the traditional liturgy is a very effective representation, rather more so, I think, than the new rite of the Mass, that the world of the human here and now, and certainly too the world of the human past, is not our true home. It is not our patria. It represents to us, through gestures and through texts, all those collects in Lent, the exorcisms in the traditional rite of baptism, that we have a fallen nature with attendant weakness. We live under the rule of the prince of this world when we're just born into the world. And we have a need for grace to move us as viatores or wayfarers to our true patria and heaven, which is represented in the traditional order of the sanctuary, the eastward-facing order of worship. I won't go on. We all know this. So the liturgy does not represent or celebrate some merely human community, whether of the here or now or of the past. You sometimes think the new rite of the Mass is basically celebrating the community of the here and now. Well, I think it's a bit better than that, but there is a tendency. Okay. Supposing someone feels at home in the traditional liturgy, well, what's so bad about that? You'd have thought that if you're going to feel at home anywhere on this earth, it would be better off in, feeling home at the church without some ghastly cleric coming along and sort of, distracting you and dislocating you every. So to feel at home in this traditional liturgy, as you should, is to feel at home precisely with our identity as journeying from this world, from the world of the human past as much as that of the human present. It is an acceptance of the need for true detachment from this passing world. So love of the traditional liturgy is precisely not this worldly conservative nostalgia. It is not love for a merely human past, but an expression of attachment to and commitment to a supernatural future, to the fullness of the light of that new day that St. Ambrose celebrated when he opposed the revival of the ritual tradition of his day, the rites of Rome's pagan past.